Broadcasting from Boston, Massachusetts, the ARC Digital Transformation Viewpoints podcast is the only podcast dedicated to all things related to digital transformation in energy, industrial, and critical infrastructure applications. The podcast is the creation of the ARC Advisory Group Digital Transformation Practice. ARC advises leading companies on technology trends and market dynamics that affect their business. To engage further, please like and share our podcasts or reach out directly on Twitter at ARC_advisory, or please go to the website at www.arcweb.com.
Hi, everybody. I'm Larry O'Brien, Vice President of Research for ARC Advisory Group, and we're here in another edition of our Digital Transformation podcast. Today's podcast is more OT and industrial cybersecurity focused. I have with me here today Galeal Zino, the founder and CEO of NetFoundry. Good afternoon, Galeal. How are you doing today?
Larry, how are you?
I'm really good. Thanks for joining us. So as you know, here at ARC, we track everything related to industrial cybersecurity. NetFoundry is a company that recently was at our ARC forum, our ARC Industry Forum in Orlando, and sponsored the forum, so we thank you for that, Galeal. But today we're here to talk a little bit more about what NetFoundry is doing. And I'd like to start off with my first question, and that's just sort of a general overview. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about who NetFoundry is and what it is you guys are doing and how you view industrial cybersecurity.
Yeah, always happy to talk about NetFoundry, one of my favorite topics. But even before that, Larry, pleasure meeting you and your team and your community in Orlando, I guess a few short weeks ago. Time goes by fast.
It goes by fast.
Yeah, but great event. So thank you for that. It was great to meet you guys.
Thank you.
NetFoundry, this might sound a little bit grandiose, but I started the company to solve or to help solve what we saw as two of the most important problems in the business world, cybersecurity and networking. Turns out they go hand in hand, Larry. And we can kind of unpack that, but when we look at digital transformation, Industry 4.0, Industry 5.0, AI, when we look at all these things, they're all great. However, in many ways, what they left behind in the dust was the cybersecurity model, was the networking model. And our mission at NetFoundry is essentially to catch up and rebuild the secure networking model to fit this kind of digital transformation age.
Yep, and I agree with you. Even at the forum, you could see that lots of people talking about digital transformation and the application of industrial AI. I think we get so enamored with these new technologies and implementing them that cybersecurity can a lot of times be an afterthought. It's not as attractive, I guess, as, talking about these sweeping topics like digital transformation and so forth, but it is a very necessary part of all these elements. And let's talk about your philosophy, at NetFoundry. And I think the phrase that you used, when we were talking earlier is that the network is broken. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and, how you view that?
Absolutely.
In the context of industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually it starts where you left off a bit there, Larry, in terms of, cybersecurity, quote unquote, not being attractive, or networking, quote unquote, not being attractive. I think what has changed is that in today's world, post digital transformation, or, industry 5.0, et cetera, whatever terms you want to use, in today's world, it's not really about security or networking. It's about reliability. It's about uptime. It's about business continuity. In other words, networking and cybersecurity today, as we speak, are more important in those contexts than they ever have been before. And I think, Larry, that the reason this ties together is because networking is so broken, as a term I used before. What it means is we have to bolt on a lot of stuff on top of networking. We have to kind of take something that's inherently not built for today's world, and certainly not built for a world like OT that needs the levels of uptime and reliability and predictability and security that it does. And so we bolt on all this other stuff, and then you bolt on all that other stuff, and that breaks business velocity, and that breaks agility. And actually, the complexity itself becomes insecurity. Nothing that's complex is secure. Starting at a high level, what I mean by that, if I unpack that a little bit, the way we are doing networking today is using things like IP addresses and VLANs and network routing protocols and firewalls and firewall ACLs. We're using those things as substitutes or proxies for actual identity, authentication, authorization, policy, continuous authentication, authorization. Right? These things are core to security anywhere, right? But especially on the network. And because, again, the networking, we're not doing those things, we ended up at NetFoundry and many others are as well, saying, okay, let's go from a world of IP addresses. Let's replace that with identities, like cryptographically verifiable identities, strong identities, and authentication and authorization. Let's go from a world of networking, DNS, NAT, CNAT, IP addresses, VLANs, firewalls, firewall ACLs, to a world of policies. Does this identity, under these conditions, have the right to connect to this identity under its posture? And if so, how do you connect them in a very simple, reliable manner? That's where we've taken networking and hence cybersecurity.
Yeah, and it sounds kind of like taking the zero trust, concept another step forward too, I think. So it sounds like this network overlay creates kind of a fortress of sorts, I guess you could say. I mean, one thing I've noticed when we talked about at the forum is that industrial organizations are no longer the kind of fortresses that they tried to build in the past, right? I mean, I think in the past the focus was on keeping everybody out. But that's not really possible today, right? As you mentioned when we spoke before, I mean, and I mentioned this at the forum too, organizations have become kind of porous. We have all these kind of transient inbound and outbound connections, and digital transformation has just compounded the issue, right? Where we have so many people that need so much access to so much data, throughout the enterprise, and this number is only increasing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think porous is exactly the right word. When we talked before about how digital transformation has kind of left the old secure networking model in the dust, if you look at that for OT specifically, it used to be viable and realistic to essentially keep everybody out, have a flat network, put up a big barrier between that and the rest of the world, and with some clever engineering and some hardware and some proper processes, you could do that. In today's world, with predictive maintenance, with digital twins, with big data, with AI, with inferencing, with the connectivity between OT and IT, the connectivity between OT and edge, the connectivity between OT and the cloud and vendors, yeah, porous is the word. And so you also mentioned zero trust. I think the key part of that, and that's a loaded term, right? Like we have a love-hate relationship with zero trust like everyone else, but the key part of that is assume breach, right? Assume that you're porous. Assume that things are not necessarily going to be a sunny day every single day, and build accordingly. And just clicking one step deeper, I think in OT land, what that means is if your top goals are uptime, reliability, human safety, business continuity, like those things haven't changed. And they can't change, and they won't change. No. So it's almost like, how do you reinvent the secure networking to match the new reality, to match digital transformation, Industry 4.0, Industry 5.0, while still, if anything, improving those things. And that's what we're here to do, and that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, and I think these old approaches really do represent, a threat to uptime, as you said. We find here at ARC that the users are finding more and more that cybersecurity-related incidents are now a major source of unplanned downtime. Whereas in the past it used to be things like operator error or things like that, equipment error. what have you. But now, unplanned downtime, which we estimate costs industry worldwide about, easily over $1 trillion a year. So users should definitely be thinking about cybersecurity in the context of, uptime and unplanned downtime. Can you tell us a little bit about how your solution is used specifically in OT environments? Maybe
Yeah,
some, use cases, for example?
sure. Yeah, we'll talk about three use cases to start. Depending on the organization, but let's just take, most of our customers look like maybe they have 20, 30, 40 sites globally, fairly large. And therefore all the things that you said are really important to them: uptime and reliability and human safety, and of course, business continuity and security. The three things that our customers are trying to solve. One is, how do I, as you said, essentially let the outside world in? So secure remote access in general. That can be secure remote access for vendors. That can be secure remote access for employees, contractors, machines, AIs. There's a lot there, but let's put that as kind of one general use case. The other second use case is more like data outbound from OT. So how do I let that data get to IT, get to the edge, get to the vendors, get to the cloud in a very secure manner that's, again, not going to compromise uptime and reliability, and it's going to have the right performance, jitter, latency, packet loss, et cetera. And then three is segmentation within the OT environment. So I mentioned earlier, you always want to assume the worst, right? You want to assume you're already breached. You want to assume that there's already some problems in your network. Well, segmentation becomes really important in those contexts, from perspectives like visibility, right? Even seeing the issue. Segmentation is very helpful. Obviously, if you do have the issue, kind of quarantining it or sandboxing or isolating it. And ultimately on the remediation side, if you have properly segmented, sandbox, isolated, the remediation step also not only becomes simpler and faster, but less of a threat to uptime, reliability, et cetera, because you're essentially taking action on a segment. So we've helped our customers in all three. Our platform and our software is fairly unique in that you can deploy it however you wish. So you could deploy it, let's say, fully on-prem. You could also deploy it in hybrid and cloud scenarios. So one, in terms of how you deploy it. Two, it's built to give you the identities and the policies that I described earlier for all of those use cases. It's a horizontal, just call it a platform, but you do not need to do all three use cases at once. It is built specifically to enable you, for example, to start in any of those three use cases, or even subsets of those three use cases. And we can talk about some examples later, perhaps. Three, it's built for OT. So, as a quick example, there's a lot of layer 2 in OT. It's not just layer 3. There's a lot of devices in OT that you're just not going to touch. You're not. Maybe in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, maybe. But for all intents and purposes, you're not going to touch it anytime soon. And you have different zones, and you have the Purdue model, and you have the firewall. So there's some very specific constraints in OT and some very specific functionality. Like I'm using layer 2 as an example and on-prem as an example, that has enabled us to solve all three of those use cases for our customers.
Yeah, we have lots of assets at layer 2 in the OT world. That's for sure. I'm sure, probably more than at level 3. So it does need to be able to address that OT specific, layer 2. And I'm also glad to hear you use the word a platform, right? Because we've seen the same thing, like you said before, about adding on and adding on. I think that's been kind of a previous philosophy among end users, as you bolt on security. But what we're finding is the users can't deal with that anymore, right? They don't have the resources and the expertise to handle all these different bolt-ons and different tools. They're looking for something that's more of a platformized approach, that they can centrally manage, and it takes them less time and money and effort to do that. And we definitely see that as a major trend. Can you provide any specific customer examples of, who's using this and how it's used specifically in practice in OT?
Yeah, let's do a few. One very recent was a great one. It's a large factory in Germany, they historically, rightfully so, had kind of denied every vendor proposition, let's say, to enable them to send data out of OT towards IT, ultimately to the cloud, ultimately to, actually in this case it was AWS S3, but it could have been anywhere, for very good reason. They were not going to open inbound firewall ports. They had to make sure that they essentially had a just called a virtual data diode type approach. They had to make sure they had segmentation and visibility, kill switch, like all these things had to be built in. And so in the meantime, Larry, what they're doing, because it's important to get the data up to S3 for the data analytics and data warehousing and everything else. Some of it is like kind of like SIM-SOAR type data, was SneakerNet, right? They were taking drives out of the factory and plugging them in somewhere else where they could securely upload the data to, again, in this case, S3. And of course, that's not what they wanted to do, but they had no other choice. The other choices were worse. The other choices were complexity and risk to uptime and reliability and the things we talked about earlier. And so what they did with us is they started just by solving that use case. So yeah, I mentioned earlier, like, great, we're a platform and you can use this for multiple use cases, fantastic. But you can also start with even one use case, even a use case as specific and discrete as that use case, without touching your firewalls, without touching your network, without installing software. And so that's exactly what they did. And sure, they have plans for to solve other problems. And now that the platform's in place, as they solve all those other problems, they can do it without more vendor sprawl. They have centralized identity, centralized telemetry, centralized policy, like all these good things. But for now, Larry, they're just thrilled that they no longer have SneakerNet to AWS S3.
Yeah, I can't imagine how time consuming that must be, removing drives and transporting them and everything. And that's a good place to start. And we tell people that too, this doesn't have to, when you do these types of things, it doesn't have to be a big bang kind of implementation, start with a high value use case. And I think that use case makes a lot of sense. And that's another thing we tell users is look at the business impact of what you're doing, pick something that's going to have the biggest impact. Probably with the least amount of work, to start off with, and then work your way out from there. One other thing I wanted to ask you, what sounds really interesting to me, I've heard that you're pre-installed on some major vendor networking gear. One of those examples is Siemens. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, we started by saying we have some pretty grandiose, we're a mission-driven company. We're trying to solve networking. We're trying to solve network security. We're trying to do it for OT with reliability and uptime and human safety as top priority. So to do that, we are very much a partner-first company. We believe this is a multi-layered, this is an ecosystem approach, and we want to partner with the best. And so, Cisco's an investor in NetFoundry. We have public relationships with very large U.S. MilGov type firms who bring competencies to the table. The Siemens relationship was announced relatively recently. They have fantastic technology in their Scalance product lines, their firewalls, their what's called Cynic Secure Connect. And what they did is they just built us into those solutions to make it much easier for the end customers to be able to, solve the three use cases that we talked about earlier. So, for example, the Siemens Scalance lines and other Siemens products, these range from, edge compute at the top of cells that now have zero trust capabilities. So it enables you to do kind of segmentation between cells. It enables you to do outbound out from the cells without opening firewall ports, without any risk of inbound, all to a private Siemens overlay network. It allows you to do the secure remote access with Cynic Secure Connect. So Siemens has, if folks haven't used it, Cynic Secure Connect is an incredibly robust platform. And now with a little bit of NetFoundry in it, it makes it that much easier to use, secure, and powerful.
That's very interesting. Thanks for explaining that a little bit more. Well, this has all been really great. For those that are interested in finding out more information, where can they go?
NetFoundry.io is the best place. From there, you'll find a wealth of information and different paths. I will mention that, well, like Siemens, like Cisco, we believe in open source. We do believe that we need a Linux of secure networking, let's call it, to keep it simple, Larry. So we've also open sourced kind of like our underlying software, OpenZD.
I was going to ask you about that too, actually.
Yeah, that's like the second path. Like, so you can go to netfoundry.io. If you're the type who, you want to get your hands on it, you want to see what, sure, you understand what we say is written on the tin, but you want to find out for yourself. You want to do it at your own pace, etc. You can go to openzd.io. You can go to the GitHub, etc. Just to be clear, like we didn't open source it and then ignore it. Like quite the opposite. We want it to be the Linux of secure networking. It's on that trajectory. We maintain it. We continually invest in it. So it's a thriving community of folks who are using the capabilities like in new innovative ways every day, like that we hadn't even imagined. So yeah, you have the OpenZD route, you have the NetFoundry route. And then either of those will bring you to plenty of other pathways.
Great. Those are great resources, and I really respect your support of open source. That all sounds really cool stuff. So we urge our end user customers to check out NetFoundry and OpenZD. And this is Larry O'Brien, Vice President of Research at ARC Advisory Group, and we've had with us today on our digital transformation podcast, Galeal Zino, the founder and CEO of NetFoundry. Galeal, thanks very much for joining us today.
Larry, my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully we can have you back on in the future. Look forward to it.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Yeah,
Appreciate it, Larry.
Thank you.